Chapter 31. Alex sat in the passenger seat of Matt's truck again, this time on their way back to her place. "So, you planning on moving in with me when you get the all clear from your con?" Matt took a deep breath and let it out in a rush. "That wasn't my plan. I've already asked Nick if he knows of any place for rent." "Don't you want to live with me?" She tilted her head to one side and watched him, knowing she'd asked an impossible question. She wanted to see how he would answer. He glanced at her, then looked back to the road. "It's not that I don't want to live with you, but I didn't want to make assumptions. I didn't know if you would be ready for that or not, and I thought it better to err on the side of caution." He glanced at her again. "If it makes you feel any better, I told Nick I don't want a lease, just somewhere I can go month to month, in the hopes I wouldn't be there all that long." She watched him, looking for tiny signs he wasn't being completely honest with her. She didn't find any. "Don't get a place. Move into my house. If I'm not ready for you to be in my bed full time by then, you can have another room." She didn't think they needed the other bedroom. She was pretty sure that by the time he left, she'd never want him to go anywhere. She was close to it now, and they'd not even had sex yet. That was on her list of things to do soon. JV had told her to give her body another day to heal, then she wouldn't blame her for going after the prime piece already in her bed. That was exactly what Alex had in mind. She would behave tonight, and probably while the sun was up tomorrow, but after that, all bets were off. "You're up to something," Matt said, glancing at her several times while keeping his attention on the road. "You've got that look." "Me? I'm just sitting here." She gave him her best innocent look. It was mostly true too. She had been sitting, watching him, and thinking about getting to touch him and tease him. JV had told her to stay away from anything strenuous for another day or so, but Alex was pretty sure she could keep from over-exerting or pulling at her nearly healed wound and still mess around. "You're full of shit. I can see it in your eyes, and the way you keep shifting in your seat. If you're not actually doing something yet, you're planning it." The look in his eyes said she'd never convince him otherwise. She decided to play with him a little. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just watching you." He glanced at her again. "You're not fooling me." HRMPH, she twisted around to sit right in her seat and folded her arms across her chest. "If you're gonna be that way, then fine." The silence stretched between them. In the corner of her eye, she saw him glance at her several times, but she never moved. Finally, he spoke. "You're still not fooling me." He reached across the console and tugged on a lock of her hair. "Do you know that your eyes glitter when you're up to mischief?" He waited a second or two before continuing. "They always give you up, plus it's sexy as hell." She looked at him from the corner of her eye again, and found him grinning. A smile crept across her face and she relaxed, letting her arms fall to her sides. "So, you gonna tell me what you're up to?" "Nope." She was in a good mood and knew her voice reflected that she sounded happy, some might say chirpy even to herself. "You sure?" "I'm sure. It's a surprise." She saw him glance at her sideways a couple of times. "Should I be afraid?" he asked as he parked in front of her house. "I don't know." She turned to face him and lifted one brow. "Should you?" Without waiting for an answer, she got out and went inside. Alex let Matt talk her into watching a couple movies that afternoon. She'd tried to get him to let her go down to the barn and check on things with her dad, but he'd flat refused. She hadn't really meant to go to the barn, but she knew just suggesting it would make him crazy. It had. Instead of having a fit though, he'd bribed her. If she'd spend the afternoon resting on the couch with him, then he'd take her to the barn in the morning. Since she'd been tired, though unwilling to admit it, it worked for her. He babied and waited on her while she lay on the sofa. They were about an hour into the second movie when she dozed off. It wasn't her fault. It was just so comfortable laying against his chest, his arms wrapped around her. Before she knew it, the credits were rolling up the screen, and Matt was trying to move without waking her. "Where you going?" "To make dinner. You may have been sleeping all afternoon, but you still need to eat. Someone has to cook." "I can cook." She pushed herself to sit. "I know you can, but I will. You lay back down, I'll wake you when it's ready." He kissed her on the top of the head, then disappeared into the kitchen. Alex scrubbed her hands over her face and looked at the couch where he'd been sitting. The idea of laying down without him wasn't appealing. Instead, she swung her feet to the floor and sat for a moment, blinking and trying to wake up. She stood, stretched a little, stopping when her side started to pull, then went upstairs. She took a quick shower and put on her pajamas, such as they were. She never actually slept in anything, and still hadn't since Matt had gotten there. What was the point? When he'd first crawled in with her, she was naked, why bother covering up after? Besides, as shifters, they didn't see nudity the same as a lot of normal humans. Her pajamas were what she wore around the house before bed. It was an oversized men's t-shirt she'd picked up on clearance at Walmart a couple years ago. While brushing out her hair, she smelled dinner cooking. She hurried to finish, then went downstairs to the kitchen. "What's for dinner?" she asked as she stepped into her kitchen. The house had originally been her grandparents', but her grandfather had passed away shortly after her brother, and her grandmother had died while she was in high school. She'd been surprised when they'd left the house to her, but it has been a great way to assert her independence and get out from under her parents' noses. She'd moved in when she was 19, and while she'd had a few lonely nights at first, she'd never regretted the choice. Matt looked up, then back down at the pan in front of him. It didn't last. He looked back up at her again, his brow creased. "Where did you get that shirt?" She looked down, confused. "I bought it. Why?" "I made spaghetti for dinner with beef and mushrooms. Smells heavenly." She moved closer. "Why did you want to know about my shirt?" He carried the pasta pan from the stove to the sink, where he set it in the bottom, and lifted the insert out of the base, draining the water from the noodles. "Because I didn't want you wearing something you got from some other guy." They talked about it. He knew she wasn't a virgin. She'd had a couple relationships, but they had been for fun. She had never thought about getting serious with anyone she couldn't share the same bond with that her parents had. "Oh." She thought about it a few seconds. "I don't think I've ever taken a guy's clothes." "I'm glad to hear that." He took a plate from the counter nearby, leaned over and placed a soft kiss on the back of her neck. "Feel free to wear mine if you'd like, though." He went back to making dinner, scooping a pile of noodles onto it, set it aside and repeated the process with a second. Taking both plates with him, he turned back to the stove and ladled sauce onto them both. "Sit." He carried both plates to the table and set them down. "What do you want with it?" "There's a wedge of Parmesan cheese in the fridge, and a skinny grater for it in the drawer, that's all." She watched him move around her kitchen as she took her seat at the table. Seeing him so at home and comfortable in her space warmed something inside her, and made her more sure that inviting him to live with her was the right decision. "So, tell me about moving down here." She realized there were no forks and started to get up to get them, but he stopped by the silverware drawer and grabbed them on his way back. "I want to be closer to you, this whole thing made that clear to me. But it's not just that." He handed her a fork and laid the cheese and grater next to her plate. "I want to be closer to my sister and Steve. Especially if they start a family soon. My parents will visit here on holidays, and that will be handy too. And if for some reason we don't work out, how will being so close be then? 'Cause I'm staying." This is my family home, my family ranch, my life. I know, and if it works out that way, I'll deal. We'll manage. It might not be my first choice, but we'll manage. He waited for her to use the cheese, then shredded some over his plate before starting to eat. Alex ate several bites, thinking about his words. So, will you consider moving in here instead of renting someplace? I might. But not for a while. Let's give it until I have to go back. I still need to talk to my con, and if he gives permission, I have to make arrangements for my things to be moved. I'll commit to not finding a place to rent until I'm ready to go back. That's all. We'll see how things go between now and then. She looked down at her plate, her heart racing. All right. I'll go for that. We'll see how things go over the next couple of weeks, before you make a decision on getting a place of your own. If things go well, you agree to move in here. We'll put some of your stuff in here, figure out what to do with the rest. I've got plenty of room for you to set up an office to work out of, and still have space. Just think about it. I will. I promise. They finished eating, cleaned up, and watched another movie before calling it a night.